From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
Hello and welcome to Update One. I'm Bill Loveless, a member of the broadcast podcast team at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Our guest today, Sam Eskenazi, the director of the Coalition for the National Museum of the American People. And what a story he has to tell. Sam, welcome to Update One.
Thank you, Bill.
Sam, tell us a little bit about yourself first and your work and how it contributes to the vision you have for this new museum.
Sure. I had a career with the federal government. My earliest connections with the government were spending a couple of years in the Army, including 1 year in Vietnam. My first job as a federal employee was at the Institute for Museum Services. I was the first public affairs director for IMS. It later became the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I went from there to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where I edited a magazine and did some other public affairs work for them, and then to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I was there 6 years before it opened and 2 years afterwards as Director of Public Information. And that was an amazing institution, and there's no question that to a lot of what I'm doing now with the proposal for the National Museum of the American People.
Yeah.
And then I finished up my federal career with a couple of doing public affairs work for a couple of banking agencies.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have a lot of experience that contributes to what you're working on these days. When did you first come up with this idea for this new museum?
I lived in D.C., of course, for close to 30 years. And there's one building on the National Mall that's an office building. And I always really just liked the idea that there was an office building amidst these monuments and these memorials and the Capitol and the White House. And one day, this was after I had already left the Holocaust Museum, I was just standing in front of that building. It's the Agriculture Department headquarters building. And I was just looking at it and wishing it was something else, a museum. And I asked myself the question, well, if it was a museum, what kind of museum could it be? And I just looked, I knew pretty much what was in all the museums up and down the mall. It was actually before the African American Museum was there. And it just came to me. I saw the people on the mall, and there was no museum telling the story about the American people. So that was the idea that just sprung into my head at that point. And then I turned around behind me, and directly behind me was the National Museum of American History. And I thought for an instant, no, that museum. And then I realized that museum does not tell that story. When they talk about the Smithsonian being the nation's attic, they're pretty much talking about that building. It has these amazing artifacts that touch on American history, but it's not a storytelling museum that I was used to when I was working at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And I said, well, yeah, that's what we need. We need a museum, a storytelling museum, as opposed to an artifact-based museum telling that story.
Right. Well, I want to hear more about this, your vision here. But, first, to what extent or another, we all have an immigrant background. What's yours?
My grandparents came from were in the Ottoman Empire. They were on one side on the Greek island of Rhodes, which was part of the Ottoman Empire around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. And on my father's side, they were from the island of Marmara, which is the Greek island in the middle of the Sea of Marmara, a Turkish island in the Sea of Marmara. They came through Ellis Island, pretty much immediately got on a train and headed to Seattle. My dad was born in Seattle in 1912, and my mother in 1917. I was born and raised in Seattle before I headed east.
Yeah, so interesting to look back on where we come from and who was there that made us possible. The vision for this National Museum of the American People stems from the U.S. Constitution, which begins by declaring, quote, "We the people," quote. Explain the significance of that statement for this undertaking?
The National Museum of the American People will be one of the greatest and most compelling storytelling museums in the world, as it tells that story of the making of the American people. I have a quote from Ronald Reagan that might be apropos to this. He said, "You can go to live in France, but you can't become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Italy, but you can't become a German or an Italian. But anyone from any corner of the world can come to live in the United States and become an American." And that's unique. And that story of peoples coming from every corner of our planet, from throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, and Pacific Islands, the Americas, of course, those who are already here as First Peoples, they all became Americans. And it's that Constitution, that we the people, that binds us all together.
The museum, your vision, it would be built along 4 phases of American history, starting when the first peoples came from some 20,000 years ago. That number just stood out in my mind when I first read it. Briefly, take us through these phases.
The first section of the museum, titled First Peoples Come, is from about 20,000 years ago, which is what the latest science indicates is when the first peoples came into the Western Hemisphere. And it goes up to 1607, which is Jamestown. And that period significant is bisected by 1492, that first contact with Europeans. The second chapter, The Nation Takes Form, includes that colonial period and the beginning of the country from 1607 to 1820. And it sees Western Europeans coming in during that period. And the beginning of slavery almost immediately after the first settlers at Jamestown. The Great Ingathering, about 100 years, from 1820 to 1924, when the ancestors of most of the people that are here now come during that 100-year, a little bit plus period. And the U.S. expands to the Pacific, taking in new peoples as it does so, Pacific Islands and Caribbean Islands. And then 1924, right up through today, 100 years. And you have the refugees from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, all of the immigrants who've come from everywhere in the world since 1965, when the immigration laws changed. So everybody's story who has become an American is going to be told as the visitor walks through these 4 segments of the museum story.
You know, you say there are a couple of models in Washington for this proposed museum. One is the Holocaust Memorial Museum, where, of course, you once worked. And then there's the National Museum of African American History and Culture. How would they compare to this new museum?
The National Museum of the American People, in a way, would incorporate both of those stories. The only major group that has its stories told in Washington are the African Americans in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where visitors walk along a path and they'll see that whole story unfolding through slavery, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, through to today. And it has their accomplishments of African Americans incorporated into that museum. The Holocaust Museum is about this awful event that took place in the middle of the 20th century. And its primary focus is on the Jews who were the victims of the Holocaust. And the survivors who came to this country are part of the story that the museum tells. But the story of all of America, all of the American people, is so much larger than those museums. And it would tell that there are 2 types of museums, basically. They're artifact-based museums, and you see that with virtually every art museum, natural history museum, and the National Museum of American History, of course, is an artifact-based museum with First Ladies' gowns, inventions, American inventions. But the storytelling museums are the more compelling museums. Visitors to most museums, studies have shown, are about an hour and a half or 2 hours long. And visitors to the Holocaust Museum, when I was there, we did studies that showed visitors, the average visit was about 3 hours long. Many visitors spent as long as 5 hours there because they got caught up in the story that's being told. And it's an incredibly compelling story of the Holocaust. Exactly the same thing happened at the African American Museum. Visitors were taking 3, 4, 5 hours and even more to go through the museum's permanent exhibition, telling that story where they're on a path and the story unfolds before them. And that's my vision for this museum, as you're in each one of those 4 major segments of the National Museum of the American People's story. You'll be caught up at the Holocaust Museum. It's interesting. The director of that museum did one very simple but brilliant thing. He teamed a major museum exhibition designer with a documentary filmmaker, and he put the filmmaker in charge. And that's why when you walk through that museum, it's like you're walking through a documentary of that history. And both of those museums use the same museum exhibition designer, and they both had their own storytellers, but the result was the same. Really very compelling museums that you walk through. And one element, for example, is at the Holocaust Museum. On the wall, you'll see type in 3 sizes: large, middle, small. So say a 5th grader's going through, they might look at the large type, and there's videos with maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes on a loop. The developers thought that people would look at, maybe some of the large type, maybe a little bit of middle-sized type, look on a 2-minute video loop, look for maybe 30 or 40 seconds, get an idea of it, and then move on. But people got caught up. They were reading all 3 sizes of type, going through the whole video loop and so on. And the stories are so compelling, and people in the National Museum of the American People will see their own stories. And I envision that they'll be able to have some sort of a handheld device where at the beginning of their trip through the museum, they'll be able to put in information about their own background. And there's so many people that are part this, they're part that, they're part the other. And you'll be able to put in that different background. And as you're crossing a timeline, if something happened, maybe something happened in the old country that spurred people to leave, or that there was a significant amount of information about people from a particular country, and maybe even a region of a country, and maybe even a town in a country where people came and settled in this country. As this idea develops, I think there'll be more and more scholarship where you'll be able to get to that information.
I'm ready to go there now, Sam. There's an extensive case for this museum. It's made in a 2024 report to the president, to Congress. This museum is no small undertaking. It calls for 800,000 square foot building at an estimated cost of $1.6 billion. What will it take to make this happen, and who pays for it?
My model for that part of this is the U.S. Holocaust Museum. All of the funds to plan and build that museum came from private donations. And what I would like to have is legislation that would create an entity. And there are 2 governing models. One is the African American Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian, and the other is the Holocaust Museum, which is independent of the Smithsonian. And I'm open to either one of those governing models. But I would envision that the museum, there'd be special legislation in the special section in the legislation creating the museum that would allow it to accept gifts from foreign governments. And I would envision recruiting a significant public official, say a former Secretary of State, and contact foreign countries, get gifts of 1, 5, 10, maybe up to 20 million, but with a cap so that there's no inordinate pressure on the museum as one way, and then open it up to major gifts from corporations, foundations, and wealthy individuals of 7-figure gifts plus, and then open it up to the American public for donations.
You have locations in mind in Washington?
I have 2 primary locations. One that could be open in the mid-future is the FBI building right on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's an incredible site. It's a whole block. It would be large enough to accommodate the major needs of the museum. And it would be placed about halfway between the White House and the Congress. And this would be dedicated to the bosses of the people in those two buildings. The other location is called the Banneker Overlook site. It's the end of L'Enfant Plaza, down near the Washington waterfront, the Southwest waterfront, which has been totally redeveloped over the last decade and is now probably the hottest spot in Washington.
Right. Sam, your work on this project has been assisted by many people, including students at American University under the guidance of Professor Gemma Puglisi, and she's a member of the podcast team here at the National Press Club. How have they been giving you a hand?
She teaches a communications class, and there are about eight students from the class that are pitching in and helping by arranging events like this. They have a project where they're getting some students in schools. I have one example here. Paintings or pictures on the idea of what the museum story is. And this is the first one I've seen, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm seeing there a picture of blue sky, plains, clouds, we the people, it says, and children, I take it, maybe adults from many nationalities there below it.
Exactly. And they're holding different nationality flags to indicate where they come. And up at the top, in large type, we the people. They're all part of the nation. And that's one of the projects of the students. And they've been helping out with some social media as well.
Yeah, sure. It's been a big hand. Hey, before we go, Sam, I just want to point out one other thing in this report to the president and Congress. The report says, quote, "Our nation needs this museum now as a vehicle to bring all Americans together," quote. Why is that so?
It'll provide a sense of belonging to our nation and help contribute to our national identity and help unify the country as it breathes new life into our original national motto, E pluribus unum, from many we are one. Originally, of course, it meant from many states we are one country, one united nation. And it's come to mean from many people we are one people. And this museum will help infuse that. It'll focus on our commonalities and the strength of the Constitution in bringing us all together.
Well, Sam Eskenazi, thanks for taking the time to tell us about this exciting new undertaking, the National Museum of the American People. We look forward to following your progress. For Update One, I'm Bill Loveless. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to Update One, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update One, send an email to updateonepodcast@gmail.com.